He found out the truth about the bride, but he didn't cancel the wedding. Instead, he prepared a surprise for her that she will remember for the rest of her life. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments where you're watching from. Malcolm Bryant had built his life brick by brick, rising from nothing to become one of the most influential entrepreneurs in the country. He was a man of vision, perseverance, and undeniable intellect. Every decision he made was calculated. Every step forward was part of a grander design. From an early age, he had learned that the world was not kind to those who hesitated. His mother, a woman of relentless determination, had worked multiple jobs to put food on the table after his father walked out on them when Malcolm was barely 5. Growing up in a struggling neighborhood, he had seen both the dangers of failure and the power of resilience. He had been the top student in his school, earning a full-ride scholarship to one of the most prestigious universities in the country. While others partied, he studied. While others doubted, he strategized. By the time he graduated, he had already started his first company, a tech startup that revolutionized cloud computing. Investors lined up eager to back his vision. Within a decade, he was worth over $100 million, his name synonymous with success and innovation. Despite his achievements, Malcolm had never let his wealth define him. He remained disciplined, pragmatic, and focused. Yet, beneath the armor of confidence and intellect, he harbored a secret longing, a desire for something that money could never truly buy. Love. Real, unconditional love. Not admiration, not opportunistic companionship, but the kind of love that stood the test of time. And when he met Catherine Lawrence, he believed he had finally found it. Catherine was the epitome of elegance. With striking features, icy blue eyes, and an aristocratic air that suggested centuries of refinement, she exuded an effortless charm. She had been raised in privilege, but her family's fortune had dwindled over the years, leaving them with a name far grander than their bank accounts. Yet, she carried herself as if nothing had changed, as if she still belonged to the world of the elite. Malcolm had met her at a high-profile charity gala, an event filled with old money and new wealth, where appearances mattered more than sincerity. She had been standing alone near the grand piano, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of a champagne glass, her expression distant yet alluring. When their eyes met, she smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips that made his pulse quicken. They spoke for hours that evening, their conversation a dance of wit and intrigue. She was well versed in art, literature, and the intricate politics of high society. She listened with interest as he spoke about his business, his passion for technology, his belief in innovation. She made him feel like she saw him, not as a millionaire, not as a symbol of success, but as a man. By the end of the night, he knew he wanted to see her again. Their relationship unfolded like a perfectly orchestrated symphony. Catherine was everything he had ever dreamed of in a partner: graceful, intelligent, supportive. She attended his business functions with poise, charmed his colleagues, and spoke about their future together with such conviction that he had no reason to doubt her sincerity. His friends and advisors, however, were not as easily convinced. "She's perfect," one of them had remarked with a skeptical tone. "Too perfect." Malcolm dismissed their concerns. He had spent his life making decisions based on logic and strategy. But love was different. Love required trust. And he trusted Catherine. Their engagement had been a spectacle. He had proposed on a private island, under a canopy of stars, with the ocean whispering against the shore. Catherine had gasped, tears glistening in her eyes as she accepted, slipping the diamond ring onto her delicate finger. It had been one of the happiest moments of his life. the wedding preparations began almost immediately. It was to be a grand affair, the kind that would be remembered for decades. An opulent estate was chosen as the venue, adorned with cascading flowers, crystal chandeliers, and a guest list that read like a who's who of the business and social elite. Malcolm had spared no expense, not because he wanted to impress the world, but because he wanted to give Catherine everything she deserved. He envisioned their life together, traveling the world, building a family, sharing a love that would last a lifetime. But as the wedding day approached, subtle changes in Catherine's behavior began to surface. At first, they were small, moments of distraction, unexplained absences, a certain distance in her gaze when she thought he wasn't looking. She assured him that it was simply the stress of the wedding preparations. He believed her. Then came the whispers, muted conversations that ceased when he entered the room. The offhand remark from a friend who had seen Catherine somewhere she claimed not to have been. The sense that something, somewhere, was off. Still, Malcolm pushed aside his doubts. He had never been a man to let fear dictate his actions. He had built his empire on confidence and conviction. And he had made his choice. Catherine was his future. On the eve of their wedding, he stood on the balcony of his penthouse, gazing out at the city that had once seemed so unattainable. He thought about the road that had brought him here, the sacrifices, the victories, the unwavering pursuit of success. And for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar creeping into his mind. Doubt. But tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow would erase all uncertainty. Tomorrow he would stand before the world and vow to love Catherine Lawrence for the rest of his life. Tomorrow he would become a husband. And nothing could change that. The morning light filtered through the towering windows of Malcolm's penthouse, casting golden reflections across the sleek marble floors. He stood before the mirror, fastening the buttons of his crisp white shirt, his movements deliberate yet uncharacteristically slow. Today was supposed to be a day of excitement. A day where anticipation outweighed hesitation, where love silenced doubt. Yet the uncertainty that had settled in his mind the previous night had not faded with the rising sun. It lingered like an unfinished thought, persistent and unwelcome. Catherine was already at the estate, finalizing the last details of the wedding preparations. She had left early, before dawn, sending him only a brief text telling him how much she looked forward to seeing him at the altar. He read her words again, trying to feel the warmth they should have carried. But instead of reassurance, he felt only distance. Malcolm had always trusted his instincts. They had guided him through every major decision of his life, had steered him away from pitfalls and led him to success. Yet now, when it mattered the most, his instincts were at war with his emotions. The woman he loved, the woman he was about to marry, had done nothing overtly suspicious. There were no outright betrayals, no undeniable signs of deception, and yet something deep within him whispered that all was not as it seemed. It started with the small things, glances that lingered a second too long, moments where she seemed to be somewhere else entirely, late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room. At first, he had convinced himself it was just wedding stress. But then came the whispers. His friend Jordan had been the first to voice his concerns. "You ever get the feeling that she's not all in?" Jordan had asked one night over drinks. "Like she's keeping a part of herself hidden?" Malcolm had laughed then, brushing it off as pre-wedding nerves. But as the days passed, the question settled uncomfortably in his mind. Then came the offhand remarks from other acquaintances, subtle hints that Catherine had been seen in places she hadn't mentioned, always in the company of someone she never named. He tried to silence his doubts by reminding himself who Catherine was. She was poised, elegant, the perfect partner. She was devoted, wasn't she? But love, real love, should never leave room for uncertainty. That morning, as he adjusted his tie and studied his own reflection, Malcolm realized he could not ignore the growing suspicion any longer. He needed clarity. And so, against his own hopes, he made a decision. He would seek the truth. By noon, he was sitting in his car outside the office of a private investigator, staring at the simple lettering on the door. A part of him felt ridiculous, like a man who was looking for trouble where none existed. But another part, the part that had built empires and seen through deception in the corporate world, told him this was necessary. When he stepped inside, the investigator, a man in his 50s with sharp eyes and the air of someone who had seen too much, listened to Malcolm's concerns without interruption. There was no judgment in his expression, only quiet assessment. "You want me to find out if she's hiding something?" the investigator summarized when Malcolm finished. "I want to be wrong," Malcolm admitted, surprising himself with the rawness of his words. "I want to know. I've been imagining things." The investigator nodded. "Give me a few days. If there's nothing, there's nothing. If there is, you'll have the truth." As Malcolm left the office, he felt the weight of his decision settle over him. There was no turning back now. He had set something into motion, and whatever the outcome, he would have to face it. The next few days passed in a haze of wedding preparations and forced smiles. Catherine was radiant, playing the role of the devoted fiancée flawlessly. She laughed, she planned, she spoke of their future as if it were already set in stone. And yet, when Malcolm looked into her eyes, he could not shake the feeling that she was hiding something just beyond his reach. Then came the call. 3 days before the wedding, the investigator requested a meeting. Malcolm arrived at the discreet location. His stomach twisted in knots he refused to acknowledge. He told himself that he was overreacting, that he was about to hear nothing more than a reassurance that his suspicions had been unfounded. But the moment he saw the investigator's face, he knew. There was no need for preamble. A folder was placed in front of him, thick with photographs, documents, evidence. Malcolm hesitated before opening it, steeling himself for whatever lay within. The first photograph was of Catherine, sitting at an upscale restaurant. Across from her, leaning in close, was a man Malcolm immediately recognized: Richard Montgomery. His grip on the folder tightened, but he forced himself to keep looking. The next images were worse. Catherine and Richard walking through the lobby of a luxury hotel. Catherine in his arms, her face tilted toward him, their lips almost touching. Catherine slipping into a private suite, never once looking back. The investigator spoke, but the words barely registered. The truth was right in front of him, undeniable and brutal. Catherine had never been his, not truly. She had played her part beautifully, but her heart had belonged to another man all along, Richard Montgomery, born into wealth, raised in privilege, the kind of man who had always been able to have anything he wanted, except, apparently, the Lawrence fortune, which meant Catherine had made her choice not out of love, but out of necessity. She was marrying Malcolm because he was the better deal. Malcolm sat in silence for a long time, the weight of realization crushing down on him. Every moment of their relationship replayed in his mind with cruel clarity. The calculated way she had woven herself into his life. The subtle ways she had always ensured that he remained enthralled by her. The whispers, the absences, the unanswered questions, everything now had an answer. But beneath the anger, beneath the betrayal, there was something else. A cold, calculating part of him that had been honed through years in the business world. He had built his empire on strategy, on patience, on knowing when to strike. Catherine had played him for a fool. She would regret that mistake. As he closed the folder, his mind was already forming a plan. The wedding would go on. The world would see them stand together at the altar. And then, at the perfect moment, Catherine Lawrence's carefully constructed world would come crashing down. Malcolm Bryant had spent his life building an empire from nothing. Now, he would watch as Catherine lost everything she had schemed to gain. Malcolm sat alone in his office, the city skyline stretching endlessly before him. The folder the investigator had given him lay unopened on his desk, though he had already memorized every damning image, every painful detail it contained. It had been nearly 24 hours since he had received the evidence of Catherine's betrayal, yet the initial shock had not faded. Instead, it had settled into something colder, sharper, a clarity that cut through the illusion he had allowed himself to believe for so long. He had spent years perfecting his ability to remain detached, to make decisions based on logic rather than emotion. It was what had propelled him to the top, what had turned him from a struggling kid in a broken home into a self-made success story. And yet, when it came to Catherine, he had ignored every instinct, every red flag, allowing himself to believe that, for once, he could have something real. The truth was now irrefutable. Catherine had never loved him. She had chosen him because he was the safest bet, the wealthiest bidder in an unspoken auction for her future. And all the while, she had continued her affair with Richard Montgomery, as if Malcolm were nothing more than a financial contract she was bound to fulfill. He had spent the night reviewing everything, combing through old memories with the ruthless precision of a businessman dissecting a failed investment. Every moment that had once seemed genuine was now tainted. The soft kisses, the whispered reassurances, the way she had looked at him with what he had mistaken for love, it had all been a performance. A masterful deception designed to keep him ensnared. But she had underestimated him. Most men, upon discovering such a betrayal, would have called off the wedding immediately. They would have confronted her, demanded answers, let anger dictate their actions. Malcolm, however, was not most men. He understood that revenge was not about rage or outbursts. It was about precision, control, and above all, patience. Catherine believed she had won. She believed she had secured her future, that by marrying him, she would regain the status and wealth her family had lost. She had played her role flawlessly, weaving a narrative of love and devotion so convincing that no one, not even Malcolm himself, had seen through it. Until now. And that was why he would not cancel the wedding. No, he would let it proceed exactly as planned. Every detail would remain the same. Every guest would arrive expecting a grand celebration of love and unity. The world would watch as Catherine Lawrence walked down the aisle in her custom-designed gown, believing she was moments away from achieving everything she had schemed for. And then, in front of 300 guests, in front of the cameras and the flashing lights, in front of her family, her friends, and the high society she so desperately wanted to impress, her lies would be laid bare. He had spent the morning making arrangements. Calls had been made, details finalized. There was no room for error. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life, to anticipate every move before it was made. This would be no different. He would not give her the luxury of a quiet, private confrontation. There would be no screaming match, No heated exchange where she could spin lies in an attempt to salvage what little dignity she had left. Instead, there would be only silence. The silence of a room full of people watching as her carefully constructed world shattered around her. The thought brought him no joy, no satisfaction. If anything, he felt only a cold detachment, as though he were merely overseeing another business venture. There was no longer any emotion attached to Catherine. She was not his fiancée. She was not the woman he had once loved. She was simply another liability that needed to be handled. That evening, he attended the final wedding rehearsal. Catherine greeted him with a radiant smile, slipping her arms around him as if nothing had changed. He let her, playing his part just as she had played hers. Her family was present, beaming with pride, oblivious to the storm that was about to descend. "You're quiet tonight," Catherine murmured as they stood together, watching the event planner make last-minute adjustments. "Just thinking about tomorrow," he replied smoothly, meeting her gaze with an unreadable expression. She smiled, squeezing his hand. "It's going to be perfect." He said nothing. The next day, Malcolm woke before dawn. He dressed in silence, methodically preparing for what was to come. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. The plan was already in motion. At precisely noon, he arrived at the estate. The venue was breathtaking, a testament to the extravagance Catherine had insisted upon. White roses adorned every surface, golden chandeliers sparkled overhead, and an orchestra played softly in the background. Guests were arriving, laughter and conversation filling the air. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries, accepting congratulations with a polite nod. Catherine was in her dressing room, preparing for her grand entrance, oblivious to the fate that awaited her. As the ceremony began, Malcolm took his place at the altar. The room fell into a hushed reverence as the doors opened, and Catherine stepped forward, a vision in white. The guests sighed in admiration, cameras flashing to capture the moment. She walked toward him with confidence, her expression one of triumph. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to marvel at her audacity. Even now, standing at the precipice of her downfall, she had no idea what was coming. The vows were exchanged, the officiant's words a mere formality. And then, as planned, Malcolm took the microphone, turning to address the gathered guests. "I want to take a moment to thank everyone for being here today," he began, his voice steady. "This day has been a long time in the making, and I know that many of you have traveled great distances to celebrate this union." Catherine stood beside him, smiling graciously, believing she was seconds away from victory. "And because you've all taken the time to be here, I think it's only fair that I share something with you, something important, something I recently discovered." The murmurs began, confused glances exchanged among the guests. Malcolm turned toward the back of the room where a team of discreetly positioned assistants stood ready. With a single nod from him, the screens positioned around the venue flickered to life. And then, the first photograph appeared. Catherine laughing in the dim light of a restaurant, her hand resting intimately on Richard Montgomery's. The room fell silent. Then another image. Catherine slipping into a luxury hotel, Richard's arm possessively wrapped around her waist. Gasps, a stunned murmur rippling through the crowd, and then the final blow. A series of text messages enlarged on the screens, Catherine's words displayed for all to see. "Of course, I don't love him, but once we're married, it won't matter. I'll have everything I need." She turned to him, horror dawning in her eyes. "Malcolm!" But he didn't look at her. He addressed the crowd one final time. "There will be no wedding today," he said simply, "but I do appreciate you all coming." Then he stepped away, leaving Catherine frozen in place, her perfect facade crumbling, her world reduced to nothing but whispered accusations and the cold, unrelenting weight of her own betrayal. Malcolm walked out of the ceremony hall, leaving behind the echoes of gasps and whispers. His steps were measured, unhurried, his pulse steady. He had spent the past week preparing for this moment, ensuring that every piece fell perfectly into place. There was no need for rage, no satisfaction in the destruction he had just unleashed. It was simply a necessary conclusion to a deception that had run its course. He moved through the corridors of the grand estate, ignoring the bewildered glances of staff who had undoubtedly heard the commotion inside. His mind was already calculating the next steps, considering the inevitable fallout Catherine would attempt to recover. She would seek damage control, perhaps even try to shift the narrative in her favor. But she wouldn't have that chance. He had not just revealed her betrayal. He had eliminated every escape route. By the time he reached the waiting car, his assistant, Ethan, was already there, his expression unreadable. He had been briefed on the plan in advance, though Malcolm had not shared every detail. Some things had to be witnessed firsthand. "It's done?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but tinged with something Malcolm couldn't quite place. Perhaps admiration, or maybe disbelief. Malcolm gave a curt nod and stepped into the car. The driver pulled away from the estate, leaving the chaos behind. For the first time in weeks, Malcolm allowed himself to exhale. The first stage was complete. But there was still work to be done. Catherine's downfall would not be confined to a single moment of public humiliation. That was merely the beginning. If she had truly believed she could manipulate him, she had grossly underestimated him. He had not built his empire by acting on impulse or emotion. His every move was deliberate, calculated. He opened his phone and scrolled through the messages. As expected, his inbox was flooded with notifications. Business partners, family members, journalists, all eager for a comment. He ignored them all except one, a message from the investigator. Confirmed. Montgomery's firm tied to Lawrence family debts. Send in files. A slow smile touched Malcolm's lips. He had suspected as much. Richard Montgomery was not just Catherine's lover, he was part of the scheme. The Lawrence family's financial troubles were worse than they had let on, and they had been counting on this marriage as their salvation. Now that their lifeline had been severed, they would be left scrambling. The car pulled into the underground parking lot of his high-rise, and Malcolm stepped out, his mind already shifting to the next phase. Ethan followed, silent until they reached the private elevator. "You really planned all of this?" Ethan said, shaking his head. "I mean, I knew you wouldn't just let it slide, but damn." Malcolm glanced at him. "If someone tries to play me, I don't just walk away. I make sure they never get the chance to do it again." Ethan exhaled, nodding in understanding. "And what's next?" Malcolm's gaze was steady. "We finish it." The elevator doors opened, and they stepped into the penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, a landscape of power and ambition. It was a view Malcolm had earned, built with precision and determination. And it was a view that Catherine would never share again. He walked to his desk and powered on his laptop. The files from the investigator were already waiting. He scanned the documents, confirming what he already knew. The Lawrence family's debts were extensive, hidden behind layers of shell companies and falsified assets. They had been on the verge of collapse, clinging to the illusion of wealth while their foundation crumbled. And Catherine, she had been their last desperate gamble. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, considering his options. He could simply let them fall. The scandal alone would be enough to send them into ruin. But that was not enough. He wanted to ensure that when they fell, they had nothing left to salvage. He made his first call, a banker in Zurich, someone who owed him a favor. Within an hour, any remaining credit lines the Lawrences had managed to maintain would be frozen. The second call was to an associate in the media industry. By morning, every major publication would have the full story, not just of Catherine's betrayal, but of the Lawrence family's financial deceit. The third call, however, was the most important. Richard Montgomery. The phone rang 3 times before the man answered, his voice sharp with barely concealed tension. "I was wondering when you'd call," Richard said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. Malcolm was silent for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle. "How does it feel?" "What? To know that everything you and Catherine schemed for is gone?" Richard scoffed, though there was an unmistakable edge of anxiety. "You think you've won? You embarrassed her, sure, but this will blow over. The world forgets scandals faster than you think." Malcolm smiled, though there was no humor in it. "You're right. People forget scandals, but financial ruin? That lasts." There was a pause. Richard's breathing changed just slightly. "What the hell are you talking about?" Malcolm leaned back in his chair, watching the city lights flicker. "By now, your firm is being audited. Every fraudulent deal, every mismanaged fund, it's all coming to light. And Catherine's family, they'll be lucky if they can afford their own lawyers." Silence. Malcolm let it linger before delivering the final blow. "You wanted power. You wanted influence. But you made a mistake, Richard. You bet against the wrong man." He ended the call without waiting for a response. There was nothing left to say. By morning, the headlines were everywhere. The perfect engagement had turned into a public catastrophe. Journalists dissected every detail, from Catherine's affair to the collapse of the Lawrence fortune. Photos of her standing frozen at the altar, her face a mask of horror, were splashed across every major news outlet. Richard Montgomery's firm faced immediate scrutiny, stocks plummeting as investors fled. The Lawrence family, once revered in high society, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. And Malcolm? He simply carried on. He attended meetings, closed deals, continued to build his empire. If anyone mentioned Catherine, he brushed it off with a knowing smile. She was a mistake, nothing more, a lesson learned. One evening, nearly a week after the wedding, that wasn't, Ethan knocked on his office door. "She called," Ethan said simply. Malcolm looked up unsurprised. "And?" "She wants to see you." Malcolm considered this for a long moment before shaking his head. "She made her choice." Ethan nodded and left the room. Malcolm turned back to his work, but for a brief moment he allowed himself to think of Catherine, not with anger, not with regret, just as a fragment of the past, a chapter that had been closed. She had played her game well, but she had never stood a chance. The estate was bathed in golden light as the final preparations were made. A symphony of controlled chaos played out behind the scenes, caterers rushing to arrange the last of the silver trays, florists adjusting the pristine white roses that adorned every surface, and event coordinators murmuring into discreet earpieces, ensuring that every detail was as perfect as Catherine had envisioned. The guest list read like a who's who of society's elite: business moguls, politicians, celebrities, all gathered to witness the union of Malcolm Bryant and Catherine Lawrence. The world saw it as the wedding of the year, a match of power and prestige, a fairy tale brought to life. Catherine had spent the morning secluded in the bridal suite, surrounded by a team of stylists and attendants, all working meticulously to ensure that she looked nothing short of flawless. She had woken up feeling victorious. The scandal of her family's financial troubles would be buried under the brilliance of this wedding, her name forever linked to one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the country. Once she and Malcolm were officially married, she would have everything she had fought for: security, status, a future free of worry. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times, imagining the envious gazes of the guests as she walked down the aisle, the quiet murmurs of admiration, the camera flashes immortalizing her triumph. The dress she wore had been custom-made, an intricate masterpiece of lace and silk fitted to perfection, designed to capture attention and leave an impression that would last for years. Her mother had fussed over every detail, reminding her time and time again that this was their family's redemption. "This is bigger than just you," she had whispered that morning, cupping Catherine's face in her hands. "You are restoring our legacy today." Catherine had smiled at her mother's words, basking in the knowledge that, in just a few short hours, her life would be set. She had no idea that everything was about to unravel. In another wing of the estate, Malcolm stood before a mirror, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored tuxedo. He had always prided himself on control, on ensuring that every decision he made was deliberate, every outcome carefully calculated. Today was no different. He had spent the last week preparing for this moment, ensuring that when the truth came to light, it would do so in a way that left no room for damage control. The Lawrence family had built their entire existence on illusion, and today he would strip them of it. His expression remained impassive as Ethan entered the room, checking his watch. "Everything's in place," Ethan murmured, his voice low. Malcolm simply nodded. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. Catherine had made her choice long before today. She had chosen deception, chosen to see him as nothing more than a means to an end. And now she would face the consequences. The ceremony began as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a warm glow over the estate grounds. Guests were seated in rows of elegantly adorned chairs, their chatter hushed in anticipation. The orchestral music swelled as Catherine appeared at the end of the aisle, her father beside her, his expression one of barely concealed pride. She was radiant, every step measured and graceful, exuding confidence. Malcolm watched her approach, his face unreadable. He saw the way she looked at him, her gaze filled with satisfaction. She believed she had won. The officiant's voice carried over the assembled crowd, speaking of love, commitment, and the sanctity of marriage. Malcolm listened, his mind perfectly calm, waiting for the moment he had orchestrated. The vows were exchanged, Catherine's voice steady, smooth, rehearsed to perfection. She looked into his eyes as she spoke the words that would cement her victory, the final step in her carefully laid plan. And then it was Malcolm's turn. He took the microphone from the officiant and turned slightly, addressing the guests. His voice was composed, unwavering. "I want to take a moment to thank everyone for being here today," he began, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Your presence means more than words can express. Today is a celebration, not just of love, but of honesty, trust, and the foundation upon which a real marriage is built." Catherine smiled beside him, her hands delicately folded in front of her. "And because honesty is the most important thing in a marriage, I feel that it's only right that I share something with all of you," Malcolm continued, Something I recently discovered." A murmur of confusion rippled through the guests. Catherine's smile faltered slightly. Malcolm turned toward the back of the ceremony space, where several large screens had been discreetly positioned. With a subtle nod, the screens flickered to life. The first image appeared. Catherine, sitting across from Richard Montgomery in a dimly lit restaurant, her hand resting lightly on his. The silence was immediate, sharp. Then another image. Catherine and Richard, disappearing into a luxury hotel suite, his hand on the small of her back. A gasp, a rustling among the guests, and then the final revelation, screens filled with messages blown up for all to see. Catherine's own words in cold, damning text. "Of course I don't love him, but once we're married, it won't matter. I'll have everything I need." Catherine inhaled sharply, her body going rigid. The color drained from her face as the weight of what was happening settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She turned to Malcolm, her lips parting, her voice a mere whisper. "Malcolm?" But he was already stepping back out of reach. "There will be no wedding today," he said simply, his voice carrying through the stunned silence. "But I do appreciate you all coming." He turned, walking away as the whispers erupted into full-blown chaos. Catherine stood frozen, her perfectly curated world collapsing around her. Her mother's face was stricken, her father's expression contorted with barely concealed rage. Richard, seated among the guests, was already rising, attempting to slip away unnoticed. But there was no escaping this. The press was there. The cameras were rolling. The world was watching. As Malcolm stepped into the car waiting for him outside, he exhaled slowly, his grip loosening. He had done what needed to be done, and Catherine Lawrence had lost everything she had schemed to gain. The drive away from the estate was silent. Malcolm leaned back against the leather seat, staring out at the city lights stretching beyond the horizon. The tension in his shoulders had eased, but there was no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Only the quiet weight of finality. It was done. The moment he had planned, orchestrated down to the last second, had unfolded exactly as he intended. Catherine had been exposed, her betrayal laid bare for all to see. The Lawrence family's desperation, their carefully constructed facade, had crumbled in a matter of minutes. Ethan sat across from him, his phone vibrating every few seconds with new notifications. "It's already everywhere," he murmured, scrolling through the headlines. "Social media is tearing her apart. Half the guests posted the video within minutes. The press is all over it." He paused, glancing at Malcolm. "She's finished." Malcolm said nothing. He wasn't thinking about Catherine. He wasn't thinking about Richard Montgomery or the Lawrence family's inevitable collapse. He was thinking about how quickly everything had changed, how only days ago he had been planning a future with a woman he thought he loved, a woman he had trusted. The realization sat in his chest like a weight, a dull, heavy reminder of just how deeply he had been deceived. Ethan studied him for a moment before shaking his head. "You're too calm," he said. "I expected something more. Anger, relief, something." Malcolm exhaled slowly. "I don't waste energy on people who never mattered." The words came easily, as if they had already been rehearsed in his mind. And yet, something in his own voice felt foreign. Catherine had mattered once. That was the truth. He had loved her, or at least the version of her she had allowed him to see. He had envisioned a life with her, believed that she was the one thing in his world that was real. And now, standing at the wreckage of it all, he realized how blind he had been. The car pulled up to his building, and he stepped out without another word. The night air was cool, a stark contrast to the heat of the day's events. He walked through the lobby, ignoring the curious glances from staff who had undoubtedly seen the headlines. When he entered his penthouse, the silence was overwhelming. For the first time in weeks, there were no wedding plans to review, no seating charts to approve, no Catherine waiting for him with a rehearsed smile and empty promises. He poured himself a drink and stood by the window, watching the city pulse below him. Somewhere out there, Catherine was reeling. He could imagine it now, the stunned silence after he walked away, the murmurs growing into full-blown chaos, her parents' horrified expressions as they realized everything they had gambled for was lost. She had always been good at controlling a narrative, but there was no coming back from this. A part of him wondered what she would do next. Would she try to reach him? Would she attempt to spin some last desperate lie, some excuse, as if she could undo what had been done? Or would she finally accept that the game was over? The answer came sooner than expected. His phone vibrated against the table. He glanced at the screen. Catherine. He let it ring. The second time, he turned the phone face down. By the third, he answered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. He could hear her breathing, could almost picture her on the other end, standing in the ruins of her carefully constructed life, grasping for something, anything, that could still be salvaged. "Malcolm," she said finally. Her voice was quiet, trembling, nothing like the confident, polished tone she had always used before. He didn't respond. She faltered, then tried again. "I know you hate me right now. I know I hurt you. But you have to listen to me, please." Malcolm exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against his temple. "You don't get to ask me for anything." "I didn't mean for this to happen." Her voice cracked, and for a brief moment it almost sounded real. Almost. "I didn't." "You didn't mean for what?" He cut in, his voice devoid of emotion. "For me to find out? For everyone else to see who you really are?" Silence. He closed his eyes, gripping the phone a little tighter. "You played your game well, Catherine," he said. "I'll give you that. You had me convinced. But you lost. And now you're just another footnote in a story no one will care about in a month." "Malcolm, please." The desperation in her voice was new, unfamiliar. "I need to see you, just once. Let me explain. There's nothing left to explain." "I loved you," she whispered. He almost laughed at that. Almost. "No, Catherine. You loved the idea of me. You loved what I could give you. That's not love. That's survival." Another stretch of silence. Then, finally, she exhaled shakily. "I don't know what to do." He could hear it now, the reality setting in. She had built her entire life around this marriage, had counted on it to be her salvation. And now, without it, she had nothing. "That's not my problem," he said finally, and ended the call. He placed the phone down, staring at it for a moment before turning away. He had spent enough time thinking about Catherine Lawrence. The world moved on quickly. By morning, the headlines were relentless. Reporters dissected every detail of the wedding that never was. Experts speculated on what Catherine's next move would be. Former associates of the Lawrence family came forward with stories of financial mismanagement and desperation. The family name, once held in such high regard, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. Richard Montgomery's firm took a heavy hit as well. Investors pulled out, board members scrambled to do damage control, but the damage had already been done. And Malcolm? He continued as if nothing had changed. Meetings were scheduled, deals were signed, the empire he had built remained untouchable. He had no time for the past, no patience for what-ifs or regrets. But sometimes, late at night, when the city was quiet and the distractions had faded, he would think about that moment. The moment Catherine realized she had lost. The moment she understood that the life she had planned, the life she had counted on, was gone forever. And in those moments, he felt nothing at all. The world did not stop for Catherine Lawrence. It did not pause to offer her sympathy, nor did it grant her the reprieve she so desperately needed. Instead, it moved forward at an unforgiving pace, sweeping her into the whirlwind of disgrace and public scrutiny. The morning after the disaster at the estate, she woke to a nightmare that was worse than the moment Malcolm had walked away from her. Headlines dominated every news site, social media platforms flooded with images of her humiliation. The videos were everywhere. The moment Malcolm had turned to the crowd, the flicker of confusion on her face, the instant realization as the screens behind them lit up with the truth. The camera flashes had captured every reaction, from the horrified gasps of the guests to the fury in her father's eyes. She hadn't left her room at the Lawrence family's townhouse in the Upper East Side since that night. The curtains remained drawn, the once pristine suite now strewn with the remnants of a future she no longer had. Her wedding dress, still in its protective cover, hung lifelessly in the corner, a cruel reminder of the day that had unraveled before it had truly begun. Her parents had abandoned any pretense of comfort. Her father, Theodore Lawrence, had barely spoken to her, his fury simmering beneath a brittle surface of forced composure. Her mother's sharp whispers carried through the halls, speaking of damage control, of salvaging what little was left, but there was nothing left to salvage. The Lawrence name, once associated with old money prestige, was now synonymous with scandal. Their remaining business interests, already unstable before the wedding, were now crumbling under the weight of bad press and fleeing investors. What Malcolm had revealed about their financial situation had only added fuel to the fire. Their banks had begun to pull back, cutting ties that once seemed unbreakable. Creditors circled like vultures, and the carefully maintained illusion of wealth and stability collapsed in a matter of days. Catherine had spent her life in circles where image was everything. Now, she was the woman everyone whispered about, the woman who had been exposed for what she truly was. She had believed she could control the narrative, that with enough poise and deflection, she could emerge from the wreckage with something intact. But this was not a scandal that could be spun or buried. It was absolute. She had tried to reach Malcolm. She had called once, then twice, then again and again, until it became clear that he would never answer. She had left messages, long and desperate, asking for a chance to explain, to meet, to say something that would make him understand. But deep down, she knew there was nothing she could say. The man who had once looked at her with admiration, with something close to love, was gone. And so, she had turned to Richard. She had waited for him to call, to offer some reassurance, some plan for how they could move forward. But Richard Montgomery had always been a man who valued his own survival above all else. He had been in the crowd that day, watching as Malcolm had torn their secret apart, and he had done nothing. He had not defended her, had not stood by her side as she lost everything. When she had finally worked up the courage to call him, his voice had been distant, clipped. "This isn't my problem, Catherine." The words had stunned her. "You don't mean that," she had whispered. "We were in this together." "No," Richard had replied, his tone cool. "You were in this for yourself. You were the one who thought you could pull this off. I told you Malcolm was dangerous. I told you he wouldn't let this slide. You were part of it too, she had snapped, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. You benefited just as much as I did. Don't act like you weren't standing right beside me the whole time. Richard had sighed, a long, exasperated sound. I don't have time for this, Catherine. You need to figure your own way out of this mess. We both do. And then he had hung up. The realization had hit her with crushing finality. She had always believed she understood power, that she knew how to navigate the world of wealth and influence. But in the end, she had been nothing more than a pawn. And now, stripped of everything, there was no one left to save her. Her father's fury had finally erupted 3 days later. You ruined us, he had spat, pacing the length of his study, his face red with barely restrained rage. Do you even understand what you've done? Catherine had stood frozen, clutching her arms around herself as if that could shield her from the storm. I was trying to save us, she had said weakly. Theodore had laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Save us? You were playing a game you never had the intelligence to win. He had turned on her then, his voice a cold hiss. And now, because of your arrogance, because of your greed, our name is worth nothing. The words had struck deeper than she had expected, not because they were cruel, but because she knew they were true. She had always thought she could outmaneuver Malcolm Bryant. She had believed he was blinded by love, that he would never see what she truly was until it was too late. But she had been wrong. He had seen her. He had watched and waited, playing along until he had everything he needed to destroy her. And he had done it without hesitation. The calls from former friends had stopped. The invitations that once filled her inbox had disappeared. Her social accounts were flooded with comments, some gleeful, some cruel, all reveling in her downfall. There was no sympathy in the world she had once belonged to. There was only the cold, unrelenting truth. She had lost. The final blow came a week later. Her father gathered the family in the sitting room, his expression grim. We're selling the townhouse, he announced, and everything else. Catherine felt the words like a physical blow. What? We can't afford to keep up appearances anymore, her mother said, her voice hollow. There's nothing left, Catherine. We're leaving the city. She stared at them, unable to process it. Leaving? She repeated, as if the word itself was foreign. Her father's expression was filled with disgust. This is what happens when you bet on the wrong man, he said. Catherine wanted to argue, wanted to scream that she had done what she thought was best, that she had been so close to securing everything they had needed. But it didn't matter. None of it mattered. A month ago, she had been preparing for a wedding that would cement her place among the elite. Now, she was being forced to leave the only world she had ever known, stripped of the wealth and privilege she had built her entire life around. And the worst part, she knew she had done it to herself. Years passed, but the memory of that day never truly faded. Scandals had their way of slipping from the public's consciousness, of being replaced by new headlines, new controversies, new stories that captured attention. But for those who had lived through them, for those who had lost everything, the past had a way of lingering, of haunting in the quietest of moments. For Malcolm Bryant, life moved forward. His empire only grew stronger, expanding beyond what even he had once envisioned. His name, already synonymous with success, became even more revered, not just as a businessman, but as a man who had outmaneuvered deception itself. He had proven that he was not someone to be played. Those who had once whispered doubts about his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of wealth and influence now spoke of him with admiration, or at the very least with caution. His life was not untouched by the past, but he refused to let it define him. He buried himself in work, in the relentless pursuit of something greater. There were relationships, fleeting but never empty. Women who came and went, drawn to him for different reasons, some more genuine than others, but he never let himself be fooled again. Love, the kind he had once believed in, was a luxury he no longer desired. And yet, despite all his accomplishments, despite the satisfaction of knowing he had risen beyond the betrayals of the past, there were nights when he found himself staring at the city skyline, his mind drifting back to a moment he had long since left behind. The weight of memory was a strange thing. It did not always bring pain, but it never quite let go either. Catherine Lawrence had disappeared from his world entirely. After the scandal, after the downfall of her family, she had vanished from the circles she once reigned over. Her name, once spoken with admiration, had become a cautionary tale, an example of what happened when ambition outstripped intelligence. The Lawrence estate had been sold off, their wealth depleted, their influence shattered. Her father, once a man who commanded respect, had faded into irrelevance, retreating from the city that no longer had a place for him. For a long time, Malcolm had not thought of her at all. She had been a lesson, nothing more. But fate had its own way of tying up loose ends. It was on an unremarkable evening, years after it all, that he saw her again. He had been in the city for a meeting, one of countless others, another deal, another expansion. The restaurant was one he had frequented before, a quiet, upscale place where conversations were spoken in hushed tones, and every patron knew the unwritten rules of discretion. He had been seated near the window, finishing a call, when he glanced up and saw her. Catherine. The recognition came instantly, even after all this time. She was different, yet unmistakably the same. The confidence, the effortless poise, the aura of someone who had once commanded attention, it was gone. She moved quietly through the room, no longer the woman who had once been the center of every gathering. She wore a simple black dress, understated, elegant in a way that did not demand admiration but rather avoided it. She did not see him at first. She was focused on her work, carrying a tray to one of the tables, speaking softly to the patrons. A waitress. For a moment, Malcolm simply watched. He had imagined many endings for Catherine Lawrence, but this had never been one of them. He had expected her to land somewhere, perhaps not in wealth, but in comfort, using whatever charm she had left to secure a future. But here she was, serving people who once would have fought to be in her company. She turned, and their eyes met. It was fleeting, just a second. But in that instant, recognition flashed across her face. Shock, shame, something else, something she quickly masked before looking away. She did not acknowledge him. She did not try to speak. Instead, she continued her work, moving as if nothing had happened. Malcolm could have called her over, could have spoken, if only to see what she would say, if she would make excuses, if she would attempt to rewrite the past. But he didn't. He simply watched for another moment, then rose from his seat. As he left the restaurant, stepping into the cool night air, he felt nothing. No triumph, no lingering bitterness, only the quiet knowledge that the past had settled itself, in the way it always did. Catherine Lawrence had gambled and lost, and Malcolm Bryant had never looked back. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Check out more of our videos for stories that will keep you hooked. Share this video with others and let us know where you're watching from in the comments.